please don't hesitate to put them in the chat function. I think the only other thing to just comment on is we did have quite a few registered, so could I just remind you to keep yourself on mute, and obviously it probably helps not to run the video if your bandwidth is in any way restricted. So just with those two little bits of housekeeping, I think we're ready to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a 20-minute presentation and then 10 minutes of questions. If there are no questions, and I'm aware that I've got the wider HYC team actually online this afternoon, so there's an awful lot of the people who've done an awful lot of hard work in bringing these results together. And so we're going to have a 10-minute discussion at the end of each crop section. So start with wheat, move to canola, and then finish with barley. So I think we're all okay to move in, and hopefully you can all see the screen in terms of hyper-yielding crops. It should read with wheat as the first crop off the branch. So yeah, I probably in my career have not seen a season across the high rainfall zone likes of 2021. I haven't seen a season like that probably since being in New Zealand based, and before that in the UK. The yields that we achieved were yields that I never thought that I would see in Australia. And I'll just give you a glimpse of, these are our maximum yields, experimental plots, usually 12 to 15 meters long. So these aren't 1 meter square cuts. But here's an indication of the kind of yields that we achieved in this last year. And we were incredibly excited in Tasmania, and you have the site featured there at the field day, the wheat on the right, the spring sown barley on the left. We were incredibly fortunate to see another year somewhat similar to 2016. We had some very high yields in 2016, and in the years since, I've never been back to those high levels. Languishing, dare I say it, at 12 to 13 tonne a hectare, rather than up at the 15, 16, even 17 tonne a hectare. So that was really special to achieve that in the variety RGT Cesario. We had in Millicent on the mainland higher yields than we had ever recorded at the SA hyper yielding research site. And that was in a UK variety called Reflection, which has achieved 10 tonnes in the past, but never the likes of 12 approaching 13 tonne a hectare. If we then went to New South Wales, where we thought we had absolutely hit the jackpot in 2020, the crops did better still from a similar sowing date of about the 20th to 22nd of April and exceeded 11 tonne a hectare. Our downer for 2021 was in Nawari, where waterlogging, which is a common issue across the high rainfall zone, really cost us dearly and took us down to that 8 tonne a hectare level. In fact, our Franklin River site was actually achieving 9 tonne a hectare in milling wheat Rockstar, which was some exceptional yields based on a GSR, would you believe, of 817 millimeters of rain. So one of the things we've been trying to put our finger on is what lies behind these really large yields. It's that probably takes us to some work that Kenton's been pursuing, Kenton Porker has been pursuing with regards to trying to look out at what causes those kind of peaks in yield. And what we're beginning to pin down is something that's been a recognized physiological feature for a number of years, but that we may not always see in Australia because of soil moisture stress or indeed waterlogging. And that is that if we can capture as much growth in the 4 weeks before our flowering sweet spot for that region, and clearly a flowering sweet spot will vary depending on if we're a long season HRZ or a shorter season HRZ as we have in WA. But this period seems to be key at maximizing growth then. So we not only have to have our sweet spot, we have to know what the conditions are like in those 4 weeks before, keep the disease out. And what we're really looking for, if we're not soil moisture stressed, is bright, cool conditions in that 4-week period before flowering. We refer to this as the critical period, and it's measured typically by looking at the solar radiation divided by the temperature. And we refer to this as the photothermal quotient. And in this next graph, it's really nice to be able to see some of our work over the past 5 or 6 years put into a line graph. And you can see there the grain yields that we achieved peaking out at our Hagley site where we've been working since 2016 with 17 tonne a hectare in Calibro. As I said, we've never got back there close to that until 2021. And what you can see is that that line is relating very strongly to what we call PTQ, which is basically a ratio of solar radiation to temperature. The lower the temperature, the higher the solar radiation, the larger and bigger the PTQ. And you can see in those cases just the impact that it's having. So we know that if we can maximize growth in that critical period, we set up good potential. We may not always realize it, but sometimes it's easy to create more and more dry matter, forgetting one important point. And I want to show you this from WA last year in Esperance. Now, this isn't actually an HYC site, but it shows something extremely useful. This is a comparison of winter and spring wheats sown in mid-April to give the winter wheats the best chance. We actually experienced in 2021 higher dry matters in Esperance than we'd ever seen before at that site. What you can see is that that winter wheat, RGT crop, that featured in some of those high yields was looking really good at harvest with a very high level of harvest dry matter. Much more so than the spring wheat Rockstar or the shorter season winter wheat Illabo, and certainly significantly more than Scepter. But that higher harvest dry matter came at the expense of a flowering period in that cultivar that was a month later than the sweet spot in Esperance for flowering. As a consequence, this next graph shows you dry matter at harvest versus grain yield at harvest. And you can see down at the bottom there circled, very large dry matter at harvest, but very little ability to convert it into grain. The moral of the story here is maximizing growth in that 4-week period can't come at the expense of blowing out the flowering date, or at least not blowing it out significantly to a 3-4 week period. So we learned a lot there about how to maximize growth in that period, but not go past our actual sweet spot of flowering. And the variety that really did well at both Franklin and Esperance was Rockstar, which still managed to flower by the sweet spot and had higher harvest dry matter. Okay, let's move on and look at another of our key learnings. And you may have heard us talk about this before, but broadly speaking, one of the things we're finding is that more and more artificial nitrogen, going to 250 kilos of N, 300 kilos of N, is not the route to higher yields. And that's a bit of luck in some ways at $2.50 to $3 a kilo for N. But what it does mean is that to create high yields, we have to have a fertile farming system that can in effect be mined in those seasons of higher yield potential. And the reason for that is that we've found with these yields at 10 to 15 tonne a hectare, that at harvest, there's more nitrogen in the crop as N than we can actually get that crop to respond to in the growing season. And therefore, it's the nitrogen that's available in that paddock, either as straight available mineral N or mineralized N through the season, that makes up the difference between what the crop will feed on from the surface as fertilizer applications and what it needs to actually fulfill such enormous yields. It comes down to the fact that high yielding paddocks on farm or hyper yielding paddocks on farm will be those that actually, without any artificial fertilizer, would themselves be high yielding. Here's an example of it from Tasmania. Now, the Tasmanian site is subject to supplementary irrigation. This is actually a UK wheat, which is probably too long for a late April sowing, but it's been a variety we've used for a number of years. Here's different effects of nitrogen recorded in that grain fill period during the December, just before Christmas, effectively. And what we were looking at was the yield in particular of the unfertilized plots, although this is all 5 treatments that you've got here. The most fascinating thing was that at Christmas time, the biggest difference that we could see between these 5 treatments was actually in leaf rust infection and senescence beneath the flag leaf. And you can probably see in that picture that where we have incredibly dense canopies powered by huge amounts of N, 250 to 300, what tends to happen is that we get no light beneath the flag leaf, or we get lots of disease because of that humidity. So we actually had some real fun wagers amongst a group of us who came to the field day to find out which of these plots yielded the highest. So well done, Naomi, and I think the wine's on the rest of the group next time we see you. But what did it yield? Well, here's the yields and the final harvest dry matters from that trial in Tasmania sown into relay. And what you can see, and we started at 200 kilos of N, we had a soil core taken up just about 3 to 4 weeks after sowing that indicated we had approximately 100 kilos of N in the soil. It certainly didn't look like we had 100 kilos of N available to that unfertilized crop in the spring. But what you can see is that our attempts to push above that 200 mark in this scenario were neither rewarded with higher grain yield or dry matter. And because we were pushing the N, we felt we ought to try some treatments that pushed the phosphorus and the sulfur in this particular case. Now, this site is adequately provided in terms of soil tests with those nutrients, but you're probably saying, well, tell me what the percent carbon was. So let's look at now from the yields what N we removed at harvest. And here's the indication of the proteins that we got from 200 to 300 kilos of N, and what protein we got off of that crop that yielded, would you believe, with no fertilizer at all, 9.37 tonnes a hectare. And to give you an idea of the wagers of what it would yield in mid-November varied between 3 and 7.5 tonne a hectare. That shows you just how impoverished that crop looked. But of course, the soil was neither as warm then, and we suspect that it had not come on stream with mineralization. But something clearly fed that crop. And when you then look at the N removed in the grain, in the far right-hand column, you've got in the first column, the N we estimate from the protein that was in the grain, and then the nitrogen that was in the whole crop. And so we estimate that on top of that 100 kilos of N, this particular crop had access to another 75 coming on as mineralized N through what is a fertile farming system that's operated on that farm. And there's your organic carbon at 2.24%. So that N offtake varied somewhere between 185 and 340. And of course, we don't know with those that we applied high fertilizer to just how much came from the fertilizer or came from the soil. But what we do know is where we didn't put fertilizer on, we still had quite a respectable yield going back to that point. Hyper-yielding crops are derived from paddocks that themselves would actually generate good yields in the absence of fertilizer. Okay, let's move on to another real key point. Disease management is crucial if we're to achieve hyper-yielding crops. But if we have good genetic resistance to control disease, particularly to the diseases such as septoria and rusts, it will allow us much more flexibility in our disease management strategies and strategically allow us to use less. If we can delay decisions on disease management because we've got better genetic resistance, it gives us a clearer view of the season. It means we can go out and spray more important physiological leaves in one hit, and it'll result in less fungicides being used, which is a great anti-resistance management tool. So have we had any luck? Well, here's just a picture that, again, was taken early in the spring here at Nawari to show you the kind of resistance that we're really wanting to build into our wheats for Septoria triticide blotch, which is the scourge of the eastern states and luckily not of the west. But when it comes down to these high yields, have we got to have masses of fungicide? The answer is, in what we're finding, no, provided we've got good genetic resistance. And here you see the effect of 1 versus 4 units of fungicide. And what you can see in Hagley and Millicent is that in Hagley and Millicent with a crop, which we've been identified back in 16, which was good high yielding, it's still very high yielding, but its resistance to disease is gradually slipping. And as it slips, we're in some cases, for example, in Millicent there, getting a 5-ton response to fungicides. That's huge. But look at Big Red, Cesario, unfortunately still all red feed weeds, but look at the impact we can have with better genetic resistance and the ability to get away with one fungicide. That's yields, you say? Show me some evidence of something else. Well, you might not want to drop from 4 to 2. So here's another thought, which we call the straddle approach, where you use 2 units of fungicide, but you again start your fungicide later. So start at F-1, growth stage 33, go with a second spray on the head. Here's some results from Wallenbean for 2021. Note that 1, 2, and 4 units of spray, there is no statistical difference in those colored in yellow. And in bold in yellow, absolutely no difference in yield, although all show an advantage over the untreated. Annapurna's not statistically significant, but there's still about 0.4 of a ton in there. I've colored a crock in orange because for 2 years running, we can get less fungicide input to provide the goods in a crock at Wallenbean, but nowhere further south does it stand a chance to give us these kind of results with only 1 unit of fungicide. So in finishing, ladies and gents, before we go to any questions you might have, to capture high yield potential in the HRZ, we need to maximize growth and protect growth in this sweet spot of 4 weeks before flowering. And remember, that sweet spot is going to vary wherever you are in the high rainfall zone between long season and short season. Good disease management's essential in all of those regions to underpin high yields, because it's those spring rainfalls that encourage more disease like 2020 and 2021. But if we've got a bit more genetic resistance, we can allow that to help us use fewer fungicides more strategically. At present, we can't find a variety that will reliably, untreated, provide us with the highest profitability. At these research sites at 10 to 15 ton, it was a lot easier to identify a cultivar that could effectively only required 1 spray than it was to find one that you could leave fully untreated. And last of all, hyper-yielding wheat crops don't respond to huge amounts of N, but what they will do is they will take out more N than they will respond to, which means that they need to be growing on a medium that when it's wet and warm will release N to them and make up that difference. Okay, thanks ever so much for your attention. Does that result in any questions that people might have that they could put through the chat function?
Yeah, we've already got a few questions that have come through, Nick.
Okay, thanks, Max.
So the first one, just going back to your WA harvest index slide, I think it was, someone was just wondering where Scepter would fall in on that graph.
Yes, a really good question. And the problem that we had with Scepter was that harvest index wise, it was actually very good. And by that, you'll recall in that harvest index graph, it had lower total dry matter at harvest, but it had a good harvest index. So although it had high harvest index, unfortunately, 45% of a lower figure still resulted in lower grain yields than we were able to achieve with the likes of Rockstar and Denison in Esperance and Rockstar in Franklin River. So as long as we can keep on pushing growth into the plant without it going past the flowering sweet spot, which is what we did in Rockstar and Denison, then we actually maximized our grain yield. It's when we exceed that sweet spot that we end up with an issue.
Great, thanks. And I guess, yeah, just to follow on with WA, so in the wheat gem trial at Esperance, the 3 highest yielding varieties were Rockstar, the long reach coated lines, and Denison, which reached flowering at the 5th of August, 10th of September, and 24th of August, respectively. This is dates before the ideal window of mid to late September. However, these varieties all reached GS30 in the narrow window of the 16th to the 22nd of July, and lower yielding varieties reached GS30 either before or after this. Is it possible that the period or conditions around when the crop reaches GS30 are a major driver of yield? And if so, what would be the mechanism behind this?
Well, there's a lot in that question, and the moment I think what we're focusing on is actually that 4-week period that precedes flowering as being the most important. However, I think the question there raised is about the length of what we call the grand canopy phase, which is growth stage 30 to 60. And I know that historically, if I go back 10, 12 years, there was an awful lot of discussion about the period there, trying to lengthen that whole period out. Because in essence, what that would in effect do, if we could get good growing conditions there, is lengthen that foundation phase when we're creating grain number. The spring wheats have historically raced to growth stage 30, and what we've been looking for in Esperance is either a short season winter wheat or a long season spring. That means that it still doesn't flower too early before the sweet spot. So when you're sowing in mid-April, as I showed you then, what we're really wanting is something that utilizes that 4 weeks up to mid-September. So far, it's those short season winter wheats and the likes of Denison in particular last year that gave us the best combination of a mid-April sowing and that sweet spot in mid-September. So I still think it's worth concentrating on the fact that that growth stage 30 in spring wheats will be brought forward by earlier and earlier sowing. But what it will mean is that in a lot of cases, the flowering period is brought forward and you won't be maximizing growth in the best environmental window leading up to flowering. And that's where Scepter's probably still not utilizing the full growing season with those earlier sowings. Once you get to mid-May, not a problem.
Great, thanks, Nick. Can you please explain what you meant by straddling the fungicides?
Yeah, a straddle fungicide program is so called, and it's a concept that's been around for a number of years. In Northern Europe, it was a concept for extremely septoria resistant varieties, or spring sown wheat that doesn't suffer from septoria triticide blotch. And the reason it's called a straddle program is because the two sprays straddle the flag leaf. They go with timings either side of the flag leaf rather than directly hitting the flag leaf on emergence. And one of the reasons it might work better in some scenarios, provided the gap's no more than 3 to 4 weeks, one of the reasons it might work better is later leaf rust control can rob us of a lot of yield, particularly in the long season HRZ regions of SA, Vic and Tasmania.
Great, thank you. And I think we've probably got time for one more. Do you reckon it would be possible to regularly measure deep end mineralisation in an uncropped area nearby to each site to get a handle on endogenous N availability across the season?
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea, and one that we used to pursue in the UK, of actually going back to some monitor paddocks every year. And those monitor paddocks would actually have an area where we were not looking at the crop effect. And the reason for that was to just try and get some idea as to the mineralization that normally occurs from that soil, but also the fluctuations in how it occurs. And this is much more relevant for HRZ growers than it is anyone else, because if we get waterlogging, we get N loss to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, or on lighter soils in the HRZ, we can get leaching through the bottom of the root zone. So I think that's a really good ideal, and one that you'd certainly want to try and introduce that if you were going to do regional soil end testing.
Thanks, Nick. Might get one more quickly, just from Kenton. We can eat into his time if we need to. How do you think new varieties will hold up to lodging? So like your Cesarios and your Big Reds? Yeah, really good question. We've had RGT Cesario through our HYC first stage screening. The process, we've now looked at it for 3 years, and we're pretty confident of its standing power at these very high yields. We've had Big Red for 2 years, and we haven't had any serious issues, but at Millicent this year, the Big Red was definitely leaning, and we're just wanting to see another year of that, and possibly some combinations with plant growth regulator work into 2022 to see if that's just a feature of the variety, because these are incredible yields that these two varieties are pulling in, or whether it would give us more confidence and some response to PGRs. So for the time being, we've just seen Cesario for 3 years as opposed to Big Red for only 2. Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Nick.
Okay, no worries at all. We will stop sharing our screen and move to Rohan, assuming Rohan's online.
Yeah, I'm here. Just to make sure I get this right. Am I on the right one, or have I got to swap it over?
You're just in presenter view, Rohan.
In presenter view. Where am I again? Got my bar there, display settings. How's that?
Awesome. All yours.
Righto. Yeah, I think Nick's raised some pretty good points for canola, things around critical period and nitrogen management in terms of the response we're getting, disease management. So a lot of these themes go across canola as well, but with some sort of slightly different responses, and also I think slightly surprising sort of responses, especially in things like disease management. but I'll go along through it. So I'm grateful. So Brill Ag, who is my business with my family here, I'm grateful for the opportunity to lead this canola component of the hyper yielding crops project. Thanks to FAR for including me in that. Thanks to GRC obviously for funding this project. And our other main collaborator is Hepping Zhang, running the canola component in Western Australia. So coaching up, so Hepping with Crop Solutions WA. So thanks again for Hepping coming on board this year and doing a really professional job as well with the site in the West, which yeah, a bit of a challenge. We haven't been able to see these sites, so it's hard to have full context of exactly everything that goes on. But and thanks, I suppose, to the technical workers as well. The Darcy Warren in Victoria, Aaron, I think, has gone across both of them. Max has come on board and just hit the ground running. Kat Furman did a lot of work, and Tracy Wiley as well. Just quickly going on to 2020, just having a look at some of the numbers. The hyper yielding canola ladder. We had a pretty good season on the back of, in New South Wales at least, probably 3 below average seasons, but in 2020 we had a really good season. Wollongbean topped the ladder at 5.6 tonne of the hectare of canola, Nawari 4.8 tonne of the hectare, and Millicent 4.6 tonne of the hectare. So we were, I think Nick sort of alluded to this earlier, but we were fairly happy with these results in 2020. But 2021, things went to another level really. So Millicent and Wollongbean 6.5 and 6.4 tonne of the hectare, Warri and Vic 5.9 tonne of the hectare, and Kojonup came in for the first year of their work and 4.7 tonne of the hectare, which still was a pretty good result as well. We've been trying to target 5 tonne of the hectare for canola, and to actually get 3 of the sites to crack 5 tonne, but 2 of the sites actually go above and beyond 6 tonne of the hectare. I think was a great result. And these are results I think Nick mentioned as well. They're exposed to the elements. They're harvested with a machine harvester. They're exposed to wind and storms and that sort of thing that all other crops are. So they're actually machine yields and sort of taken from that. So I'm fairly confident in the yields that we've got. I think when I go through some of those results, it's important to sort of reflect a little bit on the site details. So canola has been done at 4 sites. So Victoria, Nawari, Kojonup in Western Australia, Millicent in South Australia, and Wollongbean in New South Wales. A few different soil types. pH has been fairly generally reasonable for canola, so in the 5s up to Millicent, which was closer to alkaline. A bit of a range in available nitrogen, so 70 kilos at Nawari, 55 at Kojonup. I didn't just have a number there for Millicent, but Wollongbean was on the back of a pasture phase and actually had 340 kilos of available nitrogen to 90 centimetres. Reasonably typical of sort of high rainfall environments compared to, say, medium-low rainfall environments, fairly high organic carbon contents. So Nawari 1.4%, probably starting to get down a little bit Nawari with cropping intensity, I suppose. Kojonup 3.6%, Millicent, which is actually classed as an organosol, 9.7% organic carbon, and Wollongbean 2%. So it's really important when we think about nitrogen responses, because we can get an estimate of mineralisation based on these organic carbon. So somewhere like Wollongbean last year probably had up around 500 mils of in-crop rainfall, and potentially we could have been getting mineralisation if the temperature and everything went with it, potentially up around that 150 kilos of mineralisation coming from that site. So that's a fair whack of nitrogen that's coming into the paddock. That's been built up at a place like Wollongbean from a system that includes legumes. So that's probably come off a 7-year pasture phase, and then the grower would take that back out into, say, 6 years of canola wheat rotation, including dual purpose crops, and sort of bring that organic carbon down with mineralisation, but then build it back up again with pasture phase. I didn't actually write the Colwell P down, but I meant to, but they were generally pretty reasonable in the 50s to 60s at all the sites. And they had reasonable application of basal P, so in the 30s up to 50 at Wollongbean. They all had sulphur at least 20 kilos a hectare. And in Victoria and New South Wales, 2 sowing dates. So we got the winters in a bit earlier, and the springs in late April. In WA, just the 1 sowing date, 20th of April. And Millicent, South Australia, just the 1 date. So some of the factors we're looking at, especially include variety choice. So things like how different phenologies respond. So especially say the real big contrast between winter and spring, different herbicide tolerance, and even different source of varieties. So we did get some the Northern Hemisphere material into the spring screen trials this year, but winter trials are basically all Northern Hemisphere derived. Crop nutrition, nitrogen's been sort of a strong component, but we've also included organic manures in the last couple of years. Seeding rate across both winters and springs, and disease management systems and fungicide use. I'll just sort of start with some of the responses that have been less consequential. So in spring seeding rate trials, so we actually should call them plant density trials. So the trial that we've done the last couple of years we've had plant density targets from 15 to 75 plants per metre squared. And it has been something that hasn't had major responses, except where we have had responses in both years at Millicent in South Australia, and up to a 0.95 tonne to the hectare response in 2021 when we went from 15 to 30 plants per square metre. So looking at the sites where we haven't had much of a response, so New South Wales, Vic and Western Australia, Darcy Warren did some NDVIs on the Victorian site on the graph on the right. And yeah, we get these really dark responses earlier on. So where he was doing NDVI in June, middle of June, so in the blue, they're 15 plants per square metre, 0.55 versus these high populations, 0.7 NDVI. And that gap sort of lasts sort of through that early winter. But then as we approach late winter and get closer to flowering, they basically converge. And so we generally have enough vegetative biomass to be able to maximise grain yield. So, but I think potentially in South Australia, it is a bit of a niche environment. It's probably slightly maritime, so the minimum temperatures are quite high and development is quite rapid. Over the top of that, the winters are probably fairly cloudy and days are short in winter everywhere. So we're getting rapid development, but cloudy days. So we actually, I think, sometimes can be limited for vegetative biomass at the Millicent environment. So that's possibly why we're getting a response going from 15 to 30 plants per metre squared at Millicent, where we're not getting that so much at other sites. At the other sites, they converge by the time we get to this critical period, and we've got enough to be able to grow enough biomass. We can capture enough resources through the critical period to grow enough crop to get full yield potential. But South Australia does appear to be a little bit different. We've also done this a little bit with winters. Haven't had any sort of consistent responses except for lodging, where generally as we get up to the plant populations, even much above 30 plants per metre squared, lodging is starting to increase. Disease management. So it actually comes in, I think compared to cereals especially, disease management comes in reasonably lowly ranked in canola. It's been surprising a little bit just to see how little response we have had to disease management. I could say this and then get completely snotted by disease in 2022, but over the past 2 years, the response from fungicide has not been particularly strong. It's been there at a couple of sites, but not strong. And I know that, I mean, a lot of the wheat varieties, if we put them into hyper yielding environments, we could lose 80 or 90% yield if something was, say, a VS to stripe rust. But there aren't a lot of commercial canola varieties. This is probably a credit to breeding. There aren't a lot of commercial varieties at the moment that would lose, say, 70 or 80% of their yield untreated with fungicide. Perhaps I could eat my words, but I hope I don't. But I think our trials have shown that the yield losses from disease have not been as strong as what we expected. So in 2021, we had 2 varieties in a disease management trial. And in the dark bars, so I've got Narwarri, Millicent, Wallenbean, Kojonup along the bottom. And I've got 45Y28 and Trifecta. So we just didn't have Trifecta at Narwarri. But the dark bars is where we went in with an intensive fungicide strategy. And the gold bars are where we had absolutely no fungicide. So no fungicide on seed, no fungicide foliar at any time. So only 2 of those 7 trials, we actually had a response of fungicide at all. And that was going from a nil fungicide to a complete fungicide management program, so the intensive fungicide program there had Soltro on seed, Prosaro at 6 leaf, Aviator X Pro at 20 to 30% bloom, and at a couple of sites had another Prosaro at 50% bloom. So I think that's been one really strong component. And you see that 2 out of the 4 trials that had a response was 45Y28, which is group BC blackleg, which is generally not so effective anymore. But Trifecta, albeit at a lower yield level, in 3 sites where it was at, didn't have a fungicide at all. So yeah, ideally we sort of want the yield potential of the 45Y28 with the disease resistance of Trifecta, but you can just see how important that disease resistance can be if you can get it into a high yielding cultivar. At the sites where there was a disease response, at Narwarri at least, it was often difficult to actually say what the response was from. We had a little bit of crown canker blackleg, a little bit of upper canopy blackleg, but there was generally not one disease where you'd say, oh, it's definitely that. Wallenbean, we had a little bit of sclerotinia, a little bit of upper canopy blackleg, both on stems and on pods, but similarly, it was hard to say that was, the yield loss was driven by X disease, because the fungicides obviously control multiple diseases, so it's hard to actually tell what the reason for a response was from. Definitely in 2021, we had more upper canopy blackleg on pods than we did in 2020, and possibly less on branches for whatever reason. But Wallenbean is known as being a hotspot for sclerotinia, but we just didn't have high levels of sclerotinia in either year. In the winters, we had a lot of lodging in the winter trials, so it's a bit hard to tell. At lower levels, the differences in fungicide management weren't significant either. But actually at Wallenbean, we actually had more sclerotinia in the winter plots, potentially from having later rain, but also because they created a really dense, humid environment compared to the springs, because they actually lodged and actually had a lot of powdery mildew in that trial as well. Variety has been really important. Where we had 6 varieties here in what we call the GEM trial. So Wahoo, Trifecta, TTs, 2 Clearfields, 45Y95, 45Y93, and 2 glyphosate tolerance, so 45Y28 and Condor. So where 45Y95 was in the sites, it was a clear standout. So doing close to 6.5 tonne of the hectare at both Wallenbean and Millicent. 45, where we didn't have the Clearfield, so Narwarri and Kojonup, we got the highest yield out of 45Y28, Narwarri, and Condor at Kojonup. At Narwarri, we also had a little trial to the side with just varieties, and 45Y95 actually topped that trial. So it was a real standout. 45Y28 was probably one of the standouts and probably more consistent over the project. So so I think that's fairly important to actually look at the variety choice that we aim for. And this is with sort of averaged across the management strategies. At Millicent, in the white there, we didn't have a response to management, but in the yellows, we had a response to management. So where we increased fungicide and nitrogen input, we had a response to management, but it was generally actually quite small at these sites. Partly that's clouded by the fact that we've gone reasonably fertile sites, so we're not getting quite as much response to improve. In the winter, generally a little bit lower yield. Sorry, let's click through that. Got my data bar in the wrong spot. A little bit higher yielding with Beast compared to 970. And these are sort of grain only situations. But generally the top yield in the winters was lower than the top yield in the spring. One thing that did stand out was in terms of biomass and harvest index. Generally, canola, if you get a high biomass, you get a low harvest index, or if you get a low biomass, you get a high harvest index. So it's pretty hard to actually couple them together. 45Y95 did actually do that last year, where we've got a biomass up around 18 tonnes of the hectare, so maybe not the highest biomass, and then a harvest index around 0.36. So if you compare that to something like Trifecta, which was much lower in biomass, so although it's got a high harvest index, I think Nick spoke about Scepter, Trifecta was just limited by its biomass and couldn't actually sort of catch up. And that's probably the TT penalty doing that. Whereas some of the other, so say Condor was a little bit down on biomass and a little bit down on harvest index. But these are really high harvest index levels, say 0.36 for canola and 18 tonne of biomass. To see a variety that ranks high for both is reasonably rare. So I think that's quite good to be able to see something like that. So 0.36 harvest index of canola is probably equivalent to about a 0.55 here of the harvest index when you account for the glucose in the seed, the amount of energy taken to grow that seed. Outside the gem, there probably are other varieties that we'll look at. So in the Roundup Ready TrueFlex group, I think we have the best available in the gem to date. In the Clearfield, we probably have the best currently available. Triazine tolerant Blazer in the variety trials with the side hole of Blazer TT did stand out, and it's certainly worth having a look at in these environments. In the winter canola, we have been a grain only focus versus actually being dual purpose, and I think we're starting to see that there's different varieties for different situations. One variety that really stood out for grain only was a coded line from AGFCA 014120, but hopefully that will be released in time, but it really did stand out. Part of that was due to lodging, I think. The Wallenbeam was just really strong soil and actually create an environment where lodging just became a monster, to be honest. The photo of myself on the left there was when things were happy and the crop was standing at around 210 centimeters tall, so that's standing up. The photo on the right is trying to pick these canola plots up off the canvas to make them harvestable a couple of months later. So we actually tried to fold them in so we could actually get them into a header so they weren't picking it up. You see some of these really high biomass, high producing dual purpose type varieties like Feast over to the left there. We've got lodging on a 1 to 9 scale being nearly an 8. So Feast was pretty much close to flat on the ground, whereas the higher yields often came from something like that AGF line where we've got an average lodging of 2.5. It's only just starting to go over a little bit, and that was probably an extreme situation, as you see. And I think that's, people ask about PGR, but I sort of love to see these varieties, in those situations where people are looking for a PGR, where we've got variety. I think variety choice is the first thing to address rather than trying to look at PGR. One aspect that was pretty exciting last year was nutrition. We spoke about nitrogen response. So 4 sites again where we had nitrogen rates of 75, 150, 225, 300. No response at the very high end site Wallenbeam in the circles. Response there at Millicent only up to 75 kilos available then, but pushing up around that 6 tonne with nitrogen. No worry, a response with 150 kilos of applied N up to nearly 5 tonne of the hectare. Cogent up a response to about 3.7 tonne with 75 kilos of N. So, we're not getting these responses to rates that are astronomical. Maybe no worry, sort of pushing up to 300 kilos urea is up there, but generally, in that range of sort of 140, 160 kilos urea, get maximising the response, partly because they are fertile sites. But where we added animal manure at rates generally around that 5 tonne of the hectare, which was chicken manure at a couple of sites, Australia and Victoria, Western Australia and New South Wales, but pig manure in South Australia and Victoria, it increased yield at every site. So WA pushing up there, nearly a tonne of the hectare. Even Millicent, where we've already got 6 tonne of the hectare, we push yield up another half a tonne. Now Warrie and Vic push yield up about 900 kilos, and Wallenbeam 400 or 500 kilos a hectare. So this is where we've already put on, 30 to 50 kilos of phosphorus. That manure response is above the 225 kilo rate. So the animal manure had 225 kilos of N plus these rates of animal manure. So it's actually, the comparison is the manure compared to the 225 N alone. So we've pushed these yields up even above and beyond the inputs of phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen that we've already had. So I think it's a challenge to work out what the response is from, but it's also exciting to see that we can push yields higher than what we just think in terms of, say, picking the right variety and just putting a nitrogen over the top of it. So there's more to it than that. I guess that's one challenge for the project going forward, is working out what the response to that is from. Interestingly, when we look at the protein in the seed, we've only averaged about 17 to 20%. So removing about 27 to 32 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of grain. So a lot of rules of thumb work on even removals of up to 40 kilos per tonne of grain, but we are not seeing those sort of removals. So that sort of helps to, when calculating how much nitrogen a crop needs, perhaps we don't need quite as much nitrogen per tonne of potential grain yield in these environments. And potentially, if we get efficiency good because we've got enough rainfall, we could actually increase that efficiency factor too. So we normally work on 50% of efficiency. So say we might need, say, 54 to 64 kilos of tonne, 54 to 64 kilos of nitrogen per tonne of target grain yield, but that's much lower than what a lot of rules have done. So I think, yeah, key messages, I think build the yield. So variety choice does that in terms of how much biomass you can grow. Nutrition's important. Plant density may be important in South Australia, but hasn't been at other sites. Protect the yield with things like variety choice again. So plant resistance, fungicide where required, but fungicide just hasn't been as compelling as we might have thought. And convert the yield. So variety choice in terms of, say, how a variety's harvest index can convert to yield. And nutrition is important too, because if you play nutrition right, you can get the crop to grow at the right time. So get the crop to grow in that critical period, which will increase the harvest index as well. So I think those components are really important. And I think it'd be great this year to sort of try to tease apart that manure response a little bit more and actually determine what's the aspect of it. Is there another nutrient that's driving the response, or is it the pattern of availability across the year? It'd be good to try to answer that. So yeah, thank you for your time, and I'll cross over to Max and yeah, answer any questions.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Rohan. Haven't had anything come through on the chat yet, but I've got a few questions here for you. But yeah, anyone feel free to pop a question in the chat and I'll ask Rohan for you. So given the low responses to disease management, what do you think about minimizing applications throughout the growing season?
Yeah, I suppose 2 years data hasn't been compelling. I guess we do a lot of disease management for insurance rather than an investment. Yeah, something like, I know Sultro seed, it's probably the kind of thing, I shouldn't say it, but it is relatively cheap. So it is probably cheaper than getting a major infection of blackleg. The things like the foliar fungicides, I guess that's where the later applications, I think in the environment where at Wallenbean, say, we're probably looking at the status quo actually being an SDHI in the seed plus a 20% bloom fungicide plus a 50% bloom fungicide. But I think we can probably pare that back a little bit. I just don't think we're getting those responses to fungicide. And this goes beyond just this work too. I've seen other trial work as well. But there'll be situations where there'll be a response and it'll be like getting a hailstorm. I just think we've got to think about fungicide in terms of return on investment rather than always just thinking insurance, because canola fungicides are not cheap. It's going to cost at least $50 a hectare to put a fungicide on generally, so they're not a cheap decision compared to cereal fungicides, I think. So, but the loss potentially could be high, but I think we can get more confidence in fungicides that I think canola has actually been more robust than cereals in terms of how it's coped without fungicides.
Great, thanks. And just a question on the manures. Were the manures incorporated, and what is it about the manures that give the yield kick, do you think?
Yeah, so the manures were just spread pre-sowing. So not actually, not ploughed in or anything, but just usually spread in front of, say, knife point press wheels. They had, I should have actually said that, they're generally around, say, 3% nitrogen, usually about 1% phosphorus, and then potassium was actually fairly common in them too, which is probably not something we've generally put on the trials. And then you go down the list of things that are in them, a lot of trace elements as well. So manures are obviously probably derived from the fertilizer and the soil that we grow the crops in anyway. The manures are coming usually from grain that we've grown previously, and a lot of that nutrition is derived from either mineralization or whatever, or fertilizer we've put into the paddock. So it is a bit of a circular thing. As to why we're getting the response, it's a place like Wallenbean where we had 340 kilos of N plus 225 kilos of N, and then got the response over and above that with manure. It suggests that it's not a nitrogen response. Even at Wallenbean, it had 50 kilos of P applied, and the manure response was over and above that. I used to think the response to manure would be that sort of slow release nature of it, but I just wonder if there is something else in there too. Is that is there some microbial response potentially that we're getting, or is it a trace element response? I'm just not exactly sure. And this year we'll actually do a trial where we add the inorganic equivalent of the manure to see if we can match the response, or if the response is beyond just the sort of inputs of the nutrients involved.
Great, thanks. And just a quick one on the N inputs. Was that split or all up front?
So the N, it was split in two applications, one at 6 leaf stage and one at bud visible stage. So yeah, two applications. We have done a little bit with timing. And just haven't had any real amazing results. We've found quite often that in these sorts of environments, it's probably generally that if you need a certain rate, the rate will trump the timing. But occasionally, the one time we have seen yield depressions has been when we've put a lot out early sowing. We just grow a lot of vegetative biomass and it gets quite tall, and they don't necessarily convert to yield quite as well. So in-crop applications have been a bit better in these environments.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Rohan. I think we'll have to leave it there in the interest of time.
Thanks.
So yeah, thank you. And next up will be Kenton Porker, and he'll be talking about barley.
Max, I might ask you to, all right, you are sharing. How are we going, Max? Can we see the
Yep. You're all good there,
barley
Kenton.
slide up there?
Yep.
All right, thanks, Max. Lucky last. I always used to say that canola was the poor cousin to barley, but I'm feeling very much well down the pecking order today. But I thought we'll just run through a snapshot of what we've seen across the hyper yielding trials last year, and really just talk to you about how we're achieving some of these high yields in the high rainfall zone. I've been using this photo a lot. It's from Millicent. It's really a picture of wheat on the right and barley on the left. And I just want to highlight some of the real issues that we're seeing in barley compared to wheat. So you see the barley plot there, it's planet, it's brackling, it's full of disease. It has been early sown in this situation, but it's certainly a much uglier crop than that wheat crop on the right. And in the planet, at this site at Millicent, we're getting yields from 2 tonne through to 10 tonne. So we're in a high rainfall zone and we're still achieving yields as low as 2 tonne when we haven't managed for disease. If we compare that to wheat, we're seeing yields from 6 through to 12.7 tonne. We saw that in reflection at Millicent. So is this aspect of managing barley or even anything in the high rainfall zone, often the crop management effects are far greater in these seasons of better potential in the high rainfall zone. So certainly in barley, so things like canopy management becomes more important as the rainfall amount goes up and we have these cool finishing high rainfall environments. Across all the trials, this is results from 2020 and 2021 across our 4 sites. So we have barley at Franklin River in 2021 in WA, and Hagley, so in Tasmania, that the barley is actually spring sown, spring irrigation sown, so sown in the first week of September. And here in Victoria, we have an earlier sowing date and a slightly later sowing date into May, and the same at SA in Millicent. If we look at this graph, let's just focus on the top 10% that we've actually achieved in these trials. If we go to WA, looking around 8 tonne, our top yields we've actually achieved in plots in WA. We go to SA, yes, we're getting up to 10 tonne, but really, majority of the time, we're just breaking through that 8 tonne barrier. Same here in Victoria. You also see the long tail here in Victoria, and that really reflects 2021 when we had waterlogging. So we're right down to 0, 1, 2, 3 tonne in some plots of spring sown barley from waterlogging, so severely affected from waterlogging. And in Tasmania, the spread we have is really, everything's been above 8 tonne. No matter what we've done, we've basically achieved 8 tonne from irrigated spring sown barley. So a very robust system in Tasmania. Actual highest yields we've achieved from those plots, let's just focus maybe on 2021 in WA, 0.37. That was in a fungicide trial, well managed. SA 10.42, early sown, 6-row winter barley. In Victoria, the 4 reps that weren't waterlogged, early sown winter barley had actually achieved 9.8 tonne. And into Tasmania, planted barley again, doing 10.89 tonne. It's a little bit short of our current record, 11.42 tonne in 2020. So how do we actually get these yields? We've heard a lot this afternoon just about getting biomass and converting more biomass into grain yield. And if I was to put my low rainfall hat on, we often think about how do we actually convert more water into biomass. And typically we know that barley does that slightly more efficient than wheat, so 53 kilograms per hectare per millimetre of water versus 49 in wheat. So that's why in the low rainfall zones, often barley has a little bit more biomass at flowering time than wheat. But as we've heard, when we come into the higher rainfall zone, we're probably not limited by water, or we're rarely limited by water. There's this aspect of making sure we're intercepting all the solar radiation we can during the critical period to increase our grain number. And that's still the critical part now for barley. How do we actually make sure it's still standing during the critical period? How do we make sure it's still managed for disease during the critical period to maximise our grain number? Because we've only really got 2 rows in barley to play with, and it's often always limited by grain number in terms of grain yield. Very similar results we've seen this afternoon, in achieving that magical 55% harvest index. So 55% of the biomass we grew converted into grain yield. Here, this graph, we have the blue is actually as spring sown barley, so achieving biomasses of 15, 20 tonne. The autumn sown spring crops ranging from, probably back here in WA, 10 through to 22 tonnes per hectare. And then the winter barley sown early in the red, also a similar range. We're trying to be as close to this line as possible. You can see the great variation. That all comes back to crop management, lodging, and maybe heat in some instances, why we're not actually achieving that higher harvest index. But the other thing you'll notice is that the autumn sown spring barley, it really drops off after 15 or 16 tonnes. So once we're achieving 16 tonne of dry matter, we're not actually converting any more of that into grain yield. So it's just how do we actually convert some of these high harvest index to grain yield with crop management, high biomass into yield for barley. So if we want to achieve high yields with barley in the high rainfall zone, we can't really achieve it without, I'm calling it active canopy management. So things like sowing time is a big part of that, crop fungicide use is a big part of that, genetics are a big part of that, and TGRs are a really important part of that as well. So if we're thinking about maximising our yield, I know there's the question earlier about in wheat, how are we actually going to achieve more yield, or is it important as we're getting up to growth stage 30, so the onset of stem elongation? Here's planted barley sown at no worry at us hitting the onset of stem elongation. If you were to dissect that plant and count how many potential grains you have, so you see all these little hooks here, these are all potential grains. If you count them up, you actually have 40. And if you come through to flag -1, so let's say late stem elongation, you've still got those 40 grains sitting there. So you've still got 40 potential grains. But from this period through to flowering is the critical period. So what often happens is, depending on how hot it is or the growing resources that crop has during that period, so keeping the leaves greener, start to see all these potential spikelets abort from the top. So we're actually trying to maximise or minimise the number of these potential spikelets that actually abort. Often the long, cooler, sunnier days contribute to more grains per spike during that period. The other thing we're trialling is to actually get more grains per spike is to have 6 rows. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It's one way we can actually get more grain number, and I guess it's some of the first time we've actually had a coordinated look at early sowing 6-row winter barley in Australia. And in barley, it's not just about the critical period, it's also about the period after harvest ripe. So we can build a big yield potential, but we have to get it into the harvester. And this aspect of head loss in barley has been, we're losing large losses in barley if we can't harvest it on time and manage that harvest logistics. So we'll walk through what we call the phenotype by environment by management trial. And what we've tried to do is really tackle all those aspects I've talked about. So managing for fungicide. So what we have here is what we're calling standard fungicide. These are 2 straight MIs, GS30 and GS39. Presence without a PGR and with a PGR. So PGR applied at 200 mils at GS31 and another 200 mils of Modus Evo at GS37. We open up, we're calling a more robust fungicide strategy. In this case, it's a Steva and SDHI on the seed, followed by I guess 2 more expensive follow fungicides, including strobilurin and different combinations of BMIs as well. We move across to what we're calling the high yielding system. Same fungicide inputs with the PGR, and we're applying an extra 40 units of nitrogen. In this case, we're targeting 10 tonnes. So the first 4 treatments I talked about are really targeting 8 tonne, but we ramp it up with the hyper yielding system. And we also have the dual purpose system where foliating crops by it's simulated grazing during tillering. This just shows you the yield responses we're getting in one cultivar in Planet across the 2 years. So the way you read these graphs are the bottom end of the tail is the lowest yield we're achieving, and the top end of the tail is the highest yield we're achieving. And really the range in between is roughly where the mean and median sit for that treatment across all of our hyper yielding sites, excluding spring sowing in Tasmania. But I think the key point here for Planet is you see standard management plus the PGR, not really any difference between those treatments. So when we're harvesting on time, the PGR is not a big component that's driving yield. In Planet, straight away as we increase our fungicide, the package or the robustness of our fungicide application, almost universally, we're increasing yield in every situation in Planet. Once again, very little evidence of an extra yield kick with the PGR or protecting more yield. In the hyper yielding treatment, we're applying more nitrogen. We're not actually achieving more yield by applying nitrogen, but we're actually introducing a little bit more variability, believe it or not, because we're getting a little bit more lodging. The dual purpose system, sown early, limited effect on yield in the high rainfall zone. So I guess you see the big response to fungicide in Planet, and that's one of the big questions we'll try and pin down this year. And we had a few experiments in that last year. Fungicide management is so important, or disease management is so important in Planet. If we're going to start using the SDHI chemistries, which are giving us a better response in Planet, how are we going to use them? Are we going to use them to really protect that critical period? Is that the best time to use them? Or do we actually have to protect them from early on in the growing season, as we've done in this case? So I mentioned before about what else are we doing? So in the genetic space, the 6-row barley, I know I've got my bike picture back there. It's standing up against the 6-row barley. And we've got a spring sown barley on the right there in Tasmania. I just want to talk you through a bit of a timeline of where we've come from in terms of, I guess, high yielding barley varieties in Australia. If you take it back to Planet, so Planet's now gone global. In 2015, it made the recommended list in the UK. 2017, it was released into Australia, and I think it's almost gone to 60 countries around the world now. So certainly a global spring barley variety that's performed very, very well across the world. So the question for me is, how do we really replace, well, not replace Planet, but if we're going to beat Planet, that's really the benchmark. So we thought about this concept of earlier sowing winter barley. It's been, you talk about the Croc story, now you see Big Red, Cesario in wheat. It's a very successful story in terms of achieving higher yields in a high rainfall zone. But the barley hasn't had that same level of development, particularly in Australia. So you go back to 1987, the first winter barley came straight out of Cambridge. It was called Elandra. And then they crossed it with a fast maturing Australian cultivar and made Urambi, released in 2005 as the grazing cultivar. Haven't had any commercial releases in barley, in winter barley since that time. Yes, we have a 6-row barley here in the hyper yielding project, but it's not yet commercial in Australia, but it did actually top our yields at Millicent in 2021 at 10.42 tonnes per hectare. So there's potential there if we can manage these slow developing cultivars. When we move into the spring sown barley trial, so Laureate is now the #1 spring barley variety in Ireland, a new barley variety yielding a little bit more than Planet in European conditions, and it's actually been our top yielder once we go to that spring sown system in Tasmania. So where might these new genetics fit in? And I talked before about management, and yes, Planet needs extra fungicide to manage it, but these cultivars have actually got improved genetic resistance, but they're actually more prone to lodging, more prone to head loss. So they're likely to need PGR or some other form of canopy management. Look at this example. This is from Millicent in 2021. Early sowing and standard fungicide achieving 3.84 tonne. And then once we ramp up the fungicide package, we're achieving up to 6.5. So clearly early sowing Planet under high disease pressure in a high rainfall zone, it is difficult to manage disease. That was a difficult trial to keep disease out of, even with the 3 or 4 units that we've had in the fungicide trial. If you see, if we just move that Planet the 12th of May, with the standard fungicide treatment, we're automatically at 6 tonnes. So yes, you move the critical period, but you also reduce the disease pressure in Planet. Excel 6-row treatment, 8.3 to 8.7, not significant in that case, but we have actually seen Excel benefit, or the winter varieties benefit from a PGR application. But once we go to the higher input, we're also achieving 8.7. So I guess the yield potential is there of these higher yielding early sown 6-row barleys. Briette, so that the second time of sowing, disease resistant than Planet, but more prone to lodging, benefiting from PGR than that case at 8.1 per hectare. And once we get into higher nitrogen and lodging control, we're actually achieving the 8.9 that we're achieving in the highest yielding 6-row early sown winter. So when the disease and lodging was managed, there was an additional benefit from that extra nitrogen. So I thought I might just finish the genetic story with some of those similar graphs I showed before. Where might the winter barley fit in, and where they haven't fitted in is WA. So a warmer, I guess more harsh finishing grain filling period and certainly an earlier flowering date in WA. What we have here is we have the planet standard system that you saw before, the planet in the hyper yielding system, and roslyn, so a fast developing quick spring barley compared to, in this case, it's winter barley. If we just look at, say, the 50% line, median yields, winter barleys aren't really close to a well-managed planet, or well-managed roslyn in this case. So certainly the downside risk of the winter barley in more drought finishing conditions is far greater. We move to SA, you start to see a similar trend. We go from planet to a better managed planet, if you like. The blue still is the benchmark, so consistently yielding above 8 tonne when it's well managed. But as I showed before, that winter barley has the potential to yield more if we get its management right and in some seasons. And as we move into Tasmania, bearing in mind this is spring sown, really almost always achieving 10 tonne when planet laureate are well managed. So two really good cultivars suited to spring sown irrigated system in Tasmania. We'll finish on the last component about, well, if we're going to use PGRs for canopy management, how might they have a fit? And this is just a really nice example from using the 6-row example here from Millicent. So we actually got in there and harvested when it was physiologically mature. The moisture was, yes, probably too high for commercial crops, but at 15% moisture, we wanted to make sure that we captured all the yield possible. And then we left plots 3 weeks. We come back 21 days later. This is what they look like. You can see even the awns have dropped off. Grain has scattered, and there's a significant amount of head loss in that winter barley. And same case with planet, I guess less head loss, but more brackling. So brackling it's not head loss, it's not lodging, it's different. It's sort of snapping at the middle, snapping in all sorts of directions of the plant. It may or may not lead to yield loss, depending really if you can pick it up with a harvester, but in most cases it is quite correlated to head loss. We just didn't quite see that in 2021. And some of the real findings, I guess, it just highlights that, yeah, winter barley certainly more prone to lodging, head loss, shattering, and cultivars differ in their head retentions, and PGRs help. And I'll show a few slides on that in a minute, but the spring barley is certainly more prone to brackling, and PGRs haven't helped us with the brackling. It's been harvest timing, so harvest timing has been more important than PGRs for brackling. I guess what it tells us, we've got head loss and brackling and lodging, and they all might require slightly different management to get them right. This is how the PGRs are working. So we have height axis, untreated, could be 200 mils here of GS31 of Modus, 200 mils of Modus at GS37, and then 200 mils at GS37, 31, and 200 mils at GS37. I want to point out the real part we're affecting with the early applications is the first stem node extension, so 12.8 versus 16, and with that later application, shortening the peduncle, so the part between the flag leaf and the head, and it's also thickening the peduncle. And when we look at these under a microscope, we've done some great work with a small Saget trial with Matt Tucker at Millicent. Also, you see, we've found that this is the real sensitive region for PGR. You look at them under an X-ray CT, yes, it's shorter, but it's also a lot denser, and the cell walls are thicker in that component, and it's helping heads hold on effectively or reduce head loss. So I showed you those pictures before of the amount of head loss we're actually achieving, or after 21 days of a harvest delay. Here's the same example. Harvesting on time, we're achieving close to 9 tonne, irrespective of PGR strategy. Mind you, we were at 15% moisture. Then when we left them 21 days, we're losing yield all of those treatments, but the PGRs are helping us. We've gone from 26% yield loss to 10% yield loss when we've treated it with a PGR, 18% in WA untreated, and to 9% when treated with a PGR. So you're still likely to achieve some yield loss, but they certainly buy you some time when we're applying a PGR. Not likely to see a yield response unless there's significant lodging, but they buy time at harvest. I think I might finish up if we're going okay for time, or
Yeah, probably good to wrap it up now if you can.
yeah,
Kenton.
I'll wrap it up.
Thanks.
And I'll finish with my summary slide there, Max. So we can't really, I mentioned, we can't achieve high yields without active canopy management in barley. And for me, once we get above 8 tonne in cool, high rainfall potential environments, the management effects in barley are almost far greater than what we see in some other districts. Radiation interception likely to be more important than maximising water use. And that's about knowing your critical period, knowing your environment, and choosing the right cultivar. A well-managed plant is still the benchmark, but managing its disease is critical to success. And we have some emerging systems that, yes, they've got better genetic resistance, but they're going to likely benefit from PGR use. So I think there's potential there to routinely achieve 8 to 10 tonnes, but I think these are some of the things that we'll have to work through. Thanks, Max.
Great, thanks, Kenton. First question, are the yields at physiological maturity adjusted down to account for higher moisture?
Yeah, they are. So we've all yields expressed are at 12.5% moisture, unless I've said differently. Yep.
Thank you. And so you were talking about 6-row varieties of barley. Will they be available commercially? And if so, can you comment on test weights of those as well?
Yeah, good question. So the commercial component, I guess, will be left up to the breeders if they see a fit and a marketability in Australia for them. I think there is still some work to be done in how we manage them. Like I've shown you some of the downside risks of 6-row winter barley, and that personally still concerns me as well. Like they certainly have the higher potential. I know they can yield more, but if things go wrong, the downside risk is far greater than 2-row spring barley. And that's, the success of Planet has been how stable it's been across multiple environments, multiple years. I'm sure it's got its weaknesses, but they seem to be manageable weaknesses at this point. The question around test weight, yeah, so we got more grain sites, and as you get away from the 2 rows, the variability in grain size also increases. We didn't see the same degree of low test weights in 2021 that we did in 2020, and I think that's because we've had this nice cool grain filling conditions in 2021, but a few hot days certainly, lower grain size and inherently low test weights for sure, as low as under the requirement for feed in 2020 in some instances. But Pixel and the ones we've chosen are probably the best, and we were actually achieving above the feed levels in 2021, which is, if you look historically, that's actually quite a big improvement. And even in Europe, you compare 6-row to 2-row, test weight is the big one. That's the big difference.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess following on from that, is there anything you reckon that can challenge a well-managed Planet crop?
Yeah, I think, well, you see some of these new European cultivars that breeders are starting to bring to market. And a few varieties last year, if you look at the germplasm trials we had, so Minotaur performing very well. I don't think it has the top end potential of Planet, but it was holding its heads and had more robust disease package. The example of Laureate in Tasmania, and you'll see Fandango come from AGF. They're all very similar to Planet. They might be, small improvements in disease management. So I'm not saying they'll give you more yield, but they might give you more flexibility in your fungicide strategy.
Thanks. Now we just had another question come in. What is the sweet spot in terms of plants per metre squared established for Planet to achieve 8 tonne plus?
Yeah, if you plotted plants per metre squared versus yield, you can achieve 8 tonne plus from anywhere from 100 to 400 plants per metre squared. And so you look at all the seeding density work we've done in the high rainfall zone, provided you've really got more than 120, 150 established plants, there's little evidence that suggests you need more. And yeah, once you go into 100 plants per metre squared, you're losing yield, sure. But and spring sown system. So if you're sowing irrigated spring sown in Tasmania, you don't have as much time to build tillering. You don't have as much time to get more stems, high seeding densities, higher plant densities up to 200 and more are favoured. But the rule of 150 plants per metre squared holds up most environments, low to high.
Great, thanks for that, Kenton. Yeah, I think we should probably leave it at that in the interest of time.
But thanks, Max. We'll just hand over to Nick and we'll wrap it all up.
Okay, thanks, Kenton. First of all, that brings us to the end of this short fire for the 3 crops that we've got. Hope that you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions subsequent to this afternoon's presentations, please fire them through. So I'd like to thank you for joining us. I know we've got people joining us online from all over Australia, and we really appreciate your interest in the project. And so firstly, thank you for giving up your time. At this end, like I say, we've been put into sort of almost panic mode by sickness with Rachel, our events and communications manager. So get well soon, Rach. We're wishing you all the best. And I'd like to really thank Max first for standing in and facilitating us, and then Rohan and Kenton for joining me in presenting what we are working our way through as probably some of the most exciting results that we've actually had the pleasure of putting together. We thought last year was good in terms of 2020, but 2021 was even better. So I think all that remains for me to say is that there will be an online version of these presentations that will come out probably next week, which would be available on the website. This session has been hopefully recorded if we've pressed all the right buttons. I'd like to thank you for your questions that you've asked throughout the sessions. It makes it so much easier for us. And I think lastly, we've already got a series of the HYC field days, the hyper yielding crops field days, planned beginning in September or the middle of September in Franklin River this year, right the way through to Tasmania on the 24th of November. So look out for those dates as they come through and details of them, and make yourself known to us, and we look forward to seeing you at those events. So in the meantime, can I wish you all the best with the coming season, and look forward to seeing you next time we meet. Okay, many thanks.